Yesterday I had a wedding, and at the reception, after learning there were no assigned seats, I took, following the lead of our gospel, took the lowest seat, only to find out once the music started I was right in front of the speaker. So I might not be able to hear you if you talk to me after Mass today. But Christ tells us to be humble, to take that lowest place. And he's not just giving us directions at a wedding reception. He's giving us directions in life. Humility is so necessary for salvation that Jesus takes every opportunity to stress its importance. Here, today, he uses the attitudes of people at a banquet or a reception to remind us again that it's God who assigns the places at the heavenly banquet. St. Jose Maria Escrivá says, "Together with humility, the realization of the greatness of man's dignity and the overwhelming fact that by grace we are made children of God form a singular attitude. That it is not our own efforts that save us and give us life. It is the grace of God. This is a truth which must never be forgotten." Humility is the foundational virtue in our spiritual life and in our life in general. Humility puts others before ourselves, puts others' needs before our own. It is living out the maxim that we hear repeated all throughout the Scriptures, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. The Jewish people, the Hebrew people, had that written on a scroll, the Shema, Deuteronomy chapter 6, the loving of your Lord, that first commandment that Christ proclaims when asked, what is the greatest of all commandments? They had that written on their doorposts, and as they would enter and exit their homes, they would proclaim that phrase, that God was first. Jesus tells us that the second is like it. It's not equal to it. It's not above it. It's like it. But so many people in our world think that if we equate loving our neighbor to loving God, that's what we're supposed to do. But God has to be first. It doesn't mean we neglect our neighbor, by no means. We can't neglect our neighbor and at the same time love God. But we can't merely love our neighbor and at the same time say and ignore God. When we act as Christians, and we all have to act, we all have lives. For Christians, act in a world the same as anyone does. We live, we breathe, we have jobs, we have families, we go to school, we have careers. We live in the world, and we're called to live in the world. We're called to evangelize the world. We're called to transform the world. But when we deal with those whom we interact with, family, friends, strangers, it should be not based on our own pursuits or for vain glory. The first thing we should always seek is God's glory, desiring heaven as our only reward. When we act, when we think, when we speak, everything should be for the greater glory of God. Does it give God glory? If it doesn't, we shouldn't be doing it. And this is how we reach out to our neighbor. This is how we're able to love our neighbor as ourselves. If we're giving God glory, we're going to, by extension, love our neighbor. This phrase, that the Hebrews posted on their doorposts was a reminder as they left for their day's work to orient them, to set their day in God's direction, aiming them to where they were heading. Just as we might get in our car and punch up an address in our phones or GPS and tell us where we're going. But also as they returned home, they would recite the prayer to offer up all that they had received and all that they had done back to the Lord in thanksgiving. That which they had done was not just their own handiwork, their own blessings, but it was truly the gift of God. For as our first reading tells us, that we who are humbled more and more, the greater we become, the more favor we find with God. And this is of vital importance, as the writer to Hebrews tells us in our second reading. This is not some idea. This is not some nice notion of a nice kind of Pollyannish view of some reality that lies before us, as obviously the Hebrews were struggling with. But no, he says, we are approaching a reality, just as when you punch an address into your GPS, it's a real location. The other night, it was kind of odd. I was, after the adoration, we were going to go out with some of the college kids at some diner. I punched in the address, and my GPS led me to the middle of a bean field. I thought it was a joke. That's not where we're heading. We're heading to a real destination. We're heading to a real place. He says we're going to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, where the angels are feasting. God, the judge of all. Christ, the mediator of a new covenant, resides there. Our destination is very defined, is very specific. It's not an empty bean field in Muncie, Indiana. It's a reality. And that's what we aim and strive for. But we can only do so through humility. As I mentioned, I had a wedding yesterday, and as I strive to tell all couples I work with, and I told this couple yesterday in their own marriage, as they just had exchanged their vows, they exchanged that ring, that beautiful symbol of their love for each other, that enduring commitment that they have made for each other for the rest of their lives. To beware. For when Adam took Eve as his wife in the garden, and he took her to be one in flesh with him for the rest of their lives, for the rest of eternity, it wasn't very long before they were torn apart. It wasn't very long before they gave in to the temptations of their own pride, their own vainglory, in which they allowed the temptations, the trickery of the serpent, to tear them apart from God, to tear them apart from each other. And we can have a great desire to be holy, a great desire to be a good person. But if we aren't willing to defend and keep those serpents away in our life that are slithering around trying to pull us away from that happiness, and aware that they're there, then they're able to just sneak up on us and get us at our weakest moments. And all of us have struggled with our sins, and we know what those weakest moments are. And that's why we need Christ. We need his church. We need the sacraments to give us that strength to win the battle. And that's where humility comes in, to recognize we need him. We need his grace. We need God. As St. Jose Maria says, it is not our own efforts that save us and give us life. It is the grace of God. This is a truth which must never be forgotten. But it is so easily dismissed in our world. We think, I can build the kingdom. I can work my salvation. There's an ancient heresy that's very much alive and well in our church called Pelagianism, that I can work out my salvation. That if I do enough good works, if I check enough boxes, then I'll get to heaven. You could do all the good works you want, but if you don't love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind and all your strength, it's impossible. Because love of God is all he asks of us. The good works will flow. They will follow. But we have to love first. And it's a real God. A God who became man and suffered and died for us. It's not a nice idea. It's not some kind of fantasy reality like unicorns or something crazy. It's a real manifested God in our midst. Emmanuel, God with us. Christ in his own life was scrutinized. We see the people are observing him carefully, looking for him to slip up, looking for any way in which they can justify their own existence, their own way of life, and not convert. And so many of us do that as well. We try to poke holes in the argument. We try to poke holes in the church and the faith because it's hard. Humility requires letting go. Letting go to what we've known or what we think we've known. And as Christ tells us, it's to those who are able to let go, to humble ourselves and place ourselves in the rear, in the back, to not make ourselves stand out with our own attributes, our own what we think is our goodness, our greatness. But allow God to see our greatness. For he looks not on the exterior, but on the interior. He looks in our hearts. Today is the feast of St. Augustine. St. Augustine has this beautiful quote. St. Augustine lived in the 3rd, 4th century. It says, God will save us with us, but he will not save us without us. We have to be cooperators with this grace. We have to want to be saved. We have to want to go to heaven. God will not force himself upon us. He will not force us into heaven kicking and screaming. If we want it, he will bless us. If we want him, he will bless us. The Catechism tells us that humility begins in our prayer. If you search humility, it leads you to the Our Father. To pray daily to God as his children in humility. To recognize that no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. The little children among us, as Christ told us to pray as. In the battle of prayer, we must confront these erroneous conceptions of prayer that lead to kind of a euphoric fulfillment of some kind of physical enjoyment, but to hone in on the reality of what God is calling us to. Does that mean that there's no such thing as some kind of physical participation in prayer? Not at all. But it has to be from the inward flowing out and not outwards. It can't be all show. Christ condemns those scribes and Pharisees standing on the corner making a big show and a mockery of the faith. For we must respond with humility, trust, and perseverance to these temptations which cast doubt on the usefulness or even the possibility of prayer. Prayer is the foundation of humility. It's getting on our knees and saying, God, I need you. I need your help. When we stop asking for God's help, we become complacent. When we become complacent, we think we've got it all, or we think we can do it on our own. None of us can get to heaven on our own. All of us need God, from the Pope, from the bishops, from the worst sinner among us. All of us need God. and all of us can grow every day in humility.